All right. So we're here with Dr. Dave, and this is a very special episode because we're talking about the book Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069, William Strauss and Neil Howe. So we have Dr. Dave here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Introduce yourself.
My name is David Rothman. I'm currently doing my PhD at University of Illinois Chicago. Grew up in Chicago, did some undergrad work in the suburbs, did my master's in Charleston, South Carolina, and have known Rich for about a year now, and really excited to discuss this book with him.
So what are you studying?
My research is primarily focused on progressive era race and disability. So I look at the intersection of the two, and particularly through how law and society is understanding and constructing race and disability and what it means to be an American in the progressive era.
Nice. So I do have a question.
Okay.
I don't know, because you're more of an academic type, do you get offended when I call you Dr. Dave? Because you're technically not a doctor yet.
I don't care.
Do people
a lot of my students always say it.
Okay.
I don't care. It doesn't bother me.
I'm not going to change. I'm not going to not call you that.
I feel like some people who have finished and are actual doctors might get a little annoyed by it, but I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this book here, Generations, and I don't know how we first started talking about it, but it's kind of right up my alley, where it's kind of like a general bird's eye view of like, hey, here's American history, and we're going to break it down based on like generational personality.
Yeah.
And they go through and they have like there's 4 cycles of American history, and we're currently in the Millennial Cycle. And then they show how the generations interact with each other and how that influences kind of like history.
Yeah, definitely.
You might have a better technical way of describing this. So why don't you describe kind of like the book and how it's organized and how they got to that theory?
Yeah, so I think both Strauss and Howe are more sociologists than they are historians, but I think what they're doing here is they're looking at the scope of American history, and they're saying that they've seen some patterns that they've recognized, and that this pattern falls into a cycle of 4 different types of generations that then repeat each other as they as they move through history. And what they're tracing is, and I assume hoping that encouraging us all to learn from this, is both how we can better understand what brought us to the point where we currently are at, and how we can maybe make some predictions about where we might be heading and how we can combat some of these crises.
I think that's the most useful part of it.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah.
Like we see what's going on with these generations and the different personality types. What does that mean going forward? And how do we, in our own generation, kind of exert ourselves and make an impact?
Right, which I find fascinating from someone who reads and constantly is just working in historical monographs. Something like this has that history base, and it's definitely looking back at times, but it's encouraging its readers to constantly be looking forward and trying to be thinking about these crises that we might have to interact with. And that's something that I don't really see a lot in traditional academic work. So it's refreshing in that sense.
Yeah. So this book was written in 1991. So it's interesting how the references they make, you kind of have to do the math in your head, because they're talking about things happening the late 80s, early 90s,
right.
And they're talking about it as if it's the present. So they're talking about like the GI generation, the silent generation, still like in a very prominent role.
Right.
Which is I thought was really interesting to calculate it in my head. And
yeah.
like, we're just in this book, they refer to millennials, and it's just like little toddlers, you know? So it's interesting though. Why don't you kind of go through, so we have 4 different types of generations, and there's 2 dominant generations that exert themselves, the idealist type generations, and then the civic generations. And so you have the idealist generation. After that is a reactive generation.
Right.
And then civic generation, and then you have adaptive generation.
Right. And the way that I've thought a lot about this, I think the easiest way to just talk about it is to look at the most recent generational cycle.
Okay.
Because it's what people are most familiar with traditionally. And in that you have the idealists are this post-World War II baby boom generation that is largely raised in a like safe and comfortable environment and are able to dominate society and have their place and really feel like they know themselves and that they identify as this generation. And they're the ones that will, in many ways, maintain or create some sense of power through like economics and politics. And then immediately after them, you have this reactive generation that's in so many ways a more artistic, quieter, but definitely rejecting their parents and more rebellious like teenager. Yeah.
They were kind of like their parents were pretty much kind of hands off.
Yeah.
And the society as a whole didn't really put much effort into like children at the time. They focused on other things in the country, right?
Right. And I think what you see out of that is that those generations oftentimes then become the like artists and they express themselves through these different mediums that oftentimes aren't like a political agenda, right? I think it's something like that. The silent generation has never had a president, I don't think.
Yeah, which is
wild.
But what's wild too is you're reading it and it's the early 90s and they're like, oh, but in the last 64, 68 years, they haven't had a president, but they're almost guaranteed to have a president this next one.
Yep.
And then Clinton won.
Yeah.
And he's not part of that generation.
Yeah.
So they never had, the only generation that's never, they have what, how many, 18 generations?
I think so, yeah. That sounds right.
Wait, no, so you mentioned Gen X, and they don't even call them Gen X in the book, which is hilarious to me.
It's so weird.
They just call them the 13 generation.
Yeah.
So we're then the 14th.
And then the one.
And then they go in the
yeah,
forward.
Yeah.
So there's technically been probably like 15 total.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the Civic Generation. Describe the Civic Generation.
So then the Civic Generation it would both be that GI, that older World War II, coming of age during World War II, and then us as millennials. And what Howe and Strauss claim is that we are the generation that will encounter a great like social, cultural, political conflict.
Secular.
Yeah.
Crisis.
And exactly. And will be forced to overcome this crisis and that we'll have to rally together, fundamentally change the institutional structure of our society in some way, and then set in place the foundation for the next generation to really like maneuver through society based off of our foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very secular, but also we have more of our like parental involvement in our upbringing, unlike the generation prior to us. We're in many ways the last line of defense for this crisis that we're going to be interacting with, and we're the ones that are going to have to, in our teen years, 20s and 30s, really have to overcome like a great conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the adaptive type.
Yeah, and that adaptive type is going to be the ones that then, after us, are maintaining our structural change to society in so many ways. So they'll oftentimes be more well-off. They'll be able to exist in a society where they have the means to enforce the policy that came out of the conflicts that our civic generation fought for and kind of created. So where we're more combative, they're more status quo, I guess I would say.
They're trying to please more so and fit in rather than create their own.
Right, exactly.
They're good managers and they
Yeah, like they're the ones that are going to take our policies and our changes, and they're going to be the managers of that class, right? They're gonna take the bureaucratic role of it and structurally enforce it until the generation after them then becomes this new idealist generation and starts to like kind of challenge the status quo a little bit and push against it a little bit, and then that's how the cycle kind of repeats itself.
But within the cycle, so you have those generation types within the cycle, but they have kind of moments or events that cause these generations to interact and to react, right? So with the idealist type, usually it comes together with a spiritual awakening.
Right. They talk with the boomers. There's that.
And this dates all the way back to the Puritans.
Yeah.
They start with this, with a spiritual awakening in like 1500s.
Yeah. Which is interesting. It's historically a lot of this theory is clearly like makes sense, and you can see it when they explain it, but it's definitely weird to like kind of put yourself back there and make these comparisons between our last 100 years and the Puritans.
Yeah.
So many ways you have that. If you're going to, again, use our most recent generational cycle, you would have the baby boomers are really the ones that are coming out of that Summer of Love, Woodstock, Expression generation, and then you have the reactive
rebelling against their GI parents.
Yeah, like the rebellious nature. And then the generation after that, you have the boomers are now in this stage where they're having children, and they're again, as we said, like more hands off on them, and for lack of a better term, the forgotten children in society, and they turn away from that spiritual expression and turn more towards like artistic expression and trying to find their place in a world where they weren't necessarily, as a child, the most important part of their family.
They have to basically like figure it out.
Yeah,
and they're kind of, it can lead to a lot of darkness.
Yeah.
And the generation that mirrors the Gen X type is the lost generation.
Right.
So these guys fighting World War I per se come back from the war, and instead they get society bans alcohol and all this stuff. Whereas the GI generation fights World War II, and what do?
Right.
They give them
everything.
The GI Bill. They give them everything.
Yeah. You get the white picket fence, the suburban house.
Yeah.
Everything's comfortable. Yeah.
All right, Dave. So we have a list here of like 14 generations and their types. Why don't we do like a highlight edition, kind of talk about them, kind of what was going on at the time, and then I'll chime in, kind of add anything that needs to be said.
Cool.
The Puritans.
Yeah, wild. And historically, this is like a little strange because the Idealist Generation here for the Puritans, they're also the ones that are in so many ways like creating just an entirely new structure, right?
Right.
So they're the ones that are like socially and culturally having to implement what their society is going to be in this like new world environment. And I think that causes a lot of, I think that might be the weirdest Idealist Generation to talk about, just because there isn't this formal structure in place necessarily as much as we'll see later throughout like American history. If that makes sense.
Then the Cavalier generation.
Yeah, like, that's
This is rough for them, I thought.
Yeah, this is very rough for them. They had a rough time. And that's talking about how they're really coming into their own during a period of like religious intolerance largely. The previous generation before them is enforcing very strict cultural norms, and they're now having to figure out how to try and break some of that down, but they're also, if you were to make the comparison to today, they're a more silent, more forgotten generation in general. So I think they really
is this the generation that's getting like burned at the stake?
Yeah. So not only are they oftentimes regarded as like less important, but at this time their views are seen as like heretics, right? So they're the ones that are being really, really shunned and pushed away, and their ideas not allowed to like flourish or grow.
The glorious generation, which is a civic type.
Right. So that would be like your comparison to like a millennial or a GI generation, and they have that as like the glorious revolution. The idea of enlightenment is really coming into play here. Liberty, the relationship between your fellow men as being a path towards like life, liberty, a pursuit of property and happiness really grows out of this like glorious revolution rhetoric. And they're challenging some of those, and not only challenging, but then breaking down some of those previous structures of intolerance that you see in society, right?
Yeah.
So they're the ones now that are saying like, okay, well, we're not just going to be burning people at the stake, right? We're more tolerant of religious differences. And that really comes out of that like glorious revolution, I would say.
Yeah. So then the next one then is the Enlightenment generation.
Yeah. And I've always been a big fan of the Enlightenment.
This is the Ben Franklin one, right?
Yeah. So these are going to be the people now that are taking those ideas of life and liberty, and they're codifying them into law, right? And they're codifying them into how society is going to work. So you'll see in constitutional documents, in large-scale political writing, that people are starting to really put these like enlightened ideas into something that works for a society or a country.
The awakening generation, the idealist type.
Yeah.
And they were born 1701 to like 1723-ish.
Right. What's a good way to talk about them? Their awakening is going to be more of this, trying to think about how to phrase it. They've inherited, right? So they started to inherit the structures of a more, again, for lack of a better term, like normal society, right? There's more structures legally in place, and then now they get to be the ones that can kind of break away from that a little bit and start to challenge the enlightened ideals through that's like a spiritual expression. You see a large religious resurgence in this awakening generation, and I really think like pushing back against some of this, maybe not pushing back, but modifying that enlightened ideals that they grew up with from their parents. Yeah.
All right, the Liberty Generation, a reactive type. I felt like it's kind of rough for them too.
Yeah, again.
Which is the consistent
thing, I think
right?
I was going to say the same thing. I think when you look through it, it just kind of seems to be pretty rough for those reactive types. So that's going to be at this, they have it as like the French and Indian Wars going on at the time. There's going to be economic struggle. There's going to be this birth of revolutionary ideas starting to be discussed and talked about. You have large-scale wars in Europe from like long-standing empires, and how that's affecting these ideas of both like liberty and then religious expression and like territorial control within your own region, and interactions between the cultural interactions, I guess, is what I really pulled away from that one, and how people are culturally interacting with all of these facets of like European society, but then they also have indigenous people, and it's just like this.
Yeah.
It's
kind of sticky there.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
The Republican generation, Civic type.
So this is going to be now where
Team Civic.
Yeah, Team Civic over here. This is going to be where you start to really see that birth of the American Revolution starting to like flourish, and this would be the generation of the founding fathers, right? These are the ones that are some of the founding fathers. So these are the ones that are really coming out and starting to, again, like structurally change what America is at the time.
Yeah, this is like your Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Marshall,
right.
Alexander Hamilton, Eli Whitney is, creating the cotton gin.
Right, and they're radically changing how society looks and is talked about and how it's discussed through their writing, but then also through their action. And I think that that's something that we'll see consistent throughout all of the civic generations, is that it's really this action that starts to take over. And with the founding fathers, it's their pressure against society to demand a structural change.
This is where they're establishing institutions and structure and making it their own.
Right.
The compromise generation.
So this is going to be the people after now this like birth of the nation, right? This the children of the founders, right? Mm-hmm. And this probably sounds horrible from someone, but this has always been to me like a very boring status quo generation, right? It seems like, and I guess we've said that before, but about the adaptive generations, but they oftentimes, especially here, reflect just not wanting to rock the boat too much, right? So,
and the civic type before them is so just so like strong and
highly regarded, right?
Confident.
Yeah. And they're just maintaining in so many ways that previous generation's structure. And I think with this, when you look back historically, again, you have to kind of put yourself there, like mentally. But the country is very, very young at this point, right? So the radicalism from these next generations isn't necessarily going to be as drastic immediately following the American Revolution, particularly because you're not trying to like immediately destroy this new structure, this new country that you just built, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The next one.
So I actually have
Transcendentalist.
In general, I wanted to kind of pick your brain about this.
Yeah.
For this whole like generation in general, because one of my like critiques of it is that this whole generational cycle seems wild and also like it undermines a lot of the arguments and theory that they're using because they just don't have a generation. They have a whole cycle.
But doesn't that so for the listeners, we've gone through there's like the colonial cycle of 4 generations. Then you have the revolutionary cycle of 4 generations that just finished with the compromise generation. Then you have the Civil War cycle. And this is the only, while they're doing their research, the only generational cycle that didn't include a civic generation type.
Right.
It goes from the transcendental generation to the Gilded Generation, and then jumps ahead to the progressive generation, which is the adaptive type. And I don't know, I think let's go through these 3 and then circle back. Okay. Cool. So the transcendental one.
Yeah, so these are
very forceful.
Very forceful. And these are going to be the Woodstock kids of the 60s. These are going to be that, but just in the turn of the century, like
your Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah, they're going out into the forests and connecting with nature and expressing themselves and viewing society as this independent trek out into the world. Right, that's what I pull away from the transcendentalists is that they're really going out and creating their own experiences through their connection with nature and with the world and with that more like tangible aspect of their society. They're going out and they're living these experiences, right? Yeah. And you don't necessarily see that with the generations around them. They're really creating, how would you say it, a form of, I guess, like cultural and social expression through their connection with like the world. It's weird to say, but
and you see as they get older, they have very strong beliefs, and this is what really tears the country apart in a way, because they're very confident in what they believe, and they're not the adaptive type where they just want to play nice and fit in. So the South, their leaders believe this, and Abraham Lincoln believes that, and all these other folks, and so it comes to a head, obviously.
Right.
Then you have the Gilded Generation.
Right. And this is going to be where some of my questions for this start to show up, because this is the generation that will be the soldiers during the Civil War. Yeah. Right? So they're the ones that are fighting the battles of that transcendentalist generation's like conflict, right? They're going to be the ones that are really taking up arms in this slavery debate in the country. And the most devastating war for America being the Civil War, it just fractures the nation, right? It's literally splits it in half. Yeah. And I also think that they get a pretty bad end of the stick here, right?
They do again.
This is a pretty bad war to fight. The technological advancements aren't there, so people are suffering very horrible wounds.
I hate that we're laughing at some of these reactive generations, but just in retrospect,
it's
as a whole, it's kind of funny.
The comedy doesn't come from what happens to them. The comedy comes that it's just every situation. It's like, wow, that must really be a bummer. It was really
just born at the wrong time in American history. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have the progressive generation. This is kind of this is your wheelhouse,
right? Which Strauss and Howe label this as adaptive and claims that there was this absence of a civic generation here, right? So they never had their millennial rising. And the progressives they're the ones that are going to be coming through this Gilded Age. They're going to be reformers in society. They're going to start to look to legal reform, educational reform. They're going to really fail to create a world where there's a dedication to the Reconstruction ideals in the nation, and that'll eventually be deconstructed by racial politics. But after this war, they're trying to figure out how to rebuild the nation into a union again after this separation with the war, right? So they're looking at every structure of society, and they're starting to kind of brick by brick build it back up.
Okay, so to talk about the Civil War cycle, so we don't have a civic generation. Is that because, this is just maybe one idea of why, but you don't have a collective America?
I was I was thinking about that, but I also feel like the values, and although, yes, the nation is split, it's still the nation. There's a war that's broken out between ideology, but generationally there's still people born, right? Like there's still something going on there. And it seems like, from my perspective with this, and I mean I could be totally wrong, but the post-war like Reconstruction, the people who would have come of age in that Reconstruction era would have been the Civic Generation, right? And I see them as being the putting into place this idea of racial tolerance, and that particularly after the Civil War, there's this big question about what do you do with a new entire minority of emancipated human beings,
citizens,
in our country.
Yeah.
How does that work? And that's where I feel, especially with the section, that maybe the book misses an opportunity to highlight that, because there are a lot of great successes in this Reconstruction era that are broken down by then what would become the early stages of that progressive generation, right? Some of the people who are saying we are, and that's what's so fascinating about this specific cycle, is because of the racial tension in the nation at the time, you have this Reconstruction generation, and they are writing into law that African American men can vote unobstructed, and that's something that's never before been seen in the country.
Right.
So you have now African American politics, African American leaders are starting to really create a political voice in the South that lasts until the end of Reconstruction, the late 1880s. And I think that one of the flaws of this is that they miss an opportunity to really highlight the success of that post-war group. I think that there's a clear connection there in my head that I see, and I'm interested as to why they missed it.
So a Civic Generation would try to come in and sweep up kind of the mess that was the Civil War,
right,
and the destruction. Was the Idealist Generation just so strong-willed that they just didn't let another generation come in and like...
Yeah, so I can see that point, but I still think that it's not even... This is the instance where like Generations then kind of breaks down a little bit for me. Because the reason why I don't see a Civic Generation here is because, just like very simply put, racism is...
Right.
Just this, how are we understanding and dealing with a post-Civil War world? And we look at, in our mindset, we always see these Civic Generations as like the heroes, the people who are going to create this long, like lasting institutional change, but they're still racist. Like there's, in the South, the generation of these people, they're still trying to deny African Americans the vote. They're trying to deny African Americans education. So because of that, I think that there's maybe more of a connection and relationship between the Idealists and then what would have been the Civic Generation here. And that's why we don't necessarily have them, is because they, due to their view of race in a post-war world, they find themselves agreeing more with that Idealist Generation than maybe we see with a couple of the other generational cycles.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely on our path there, but when you think about that same idea with like a today's society, right? I think most millennials would say that they pretty heavily disagree with like a baby boomer mentality and ideology in a lot of ways. But when the main conflict and structure in this generational cycle is race and fractured nation, I think that the Civic Generation is finding themselves both relating more with and agreeing more with what would be their baby boomer, their Idealist Generation.
Yeah. So it's hard to bring it back together.
Right. Right. But I still do think that there was an opportunity to maybe highlight some of those, the Reconstruction. I think you could have called it a Reconstruction generation and really shown how structurally a lot of these new laws and the reconstruction of the state is being brought back together following the war. So I felt like that maybe was a little bit of a weak oversight here, but interesting. Yeah. Still very interesting.
Can you elaborate more on Reconstruction? I feel like we don't hear about it enough.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think as a historian, I find that my students oftentimes think that what ends up happening is the Civil War ends and then everything's okay, and we move on to this Reconstruction where we're reunifying the nation, but we don't necessarily none of my students ever really know what happens in this period, right? So
it's kind of glossed over. Like in history, you're taught American Revolution, Civil War, and then World War I, World War II, Vietnam,
Yeah. And even, like, more specifically, I think we spent a lot of time on, like, the Roaring Twenties and, that progressive era, but we don't necessarily look at Reconstruction in the same light. And I think the reason why is because Reconstruction is overall a pretty dark point in American history from my perspective, and oftentimes I would argue that is a failure. And following the war, you do have, especially in the South, I did a lot of my master's work in Charleston, and immediately following the Civil War, you were seeing a city that, since its founding, has been dominated by plantation owners and this white patriarchal class. And now the African American community, with the support of the Northern Union Army, is starting to really, like, put into place, like, forced integration in the city, right? And they're really putting into place the ability to vote and to get an education, and they're building schools. And it looks like there's going to be this great positive change, but then you see the seeds of that Southern racism really start to seep into every facet of society, and the compromises that come out of Reconstruction eventually reunify the nation, but at the cost of all of the progress that the post-war African-American community was really making. So, like, for example, you'll see instances of access to the vote following the war is pretty open, but then you'll see both violent rejection of that through actions of, like, the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist groups, but then you'll also see, like, legal codified law put into place for literacy tests, right, at this point. And those are, like, fundamentally damaging to a community that, if you were an emancipated person in America at this point, you don't have the education to pass a literacy test, nonetheless a literacy test that's specifically targeted to be, like, overly complicated and convoluted. And those structures can stay in place until the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. So in so many ways, I look at Reconstruction as an opportunity of, like, potential great growth, but ultimately a failure.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of those, like, Southern ideas, this lost cause narrative, is recreated in this Reconstruction era, and the nation is starting to say, oh, okay, we'll highlight the whole nation, which is not just North or South. We're really trying to bring us back into this union. And you'll see Confederate monuments start to go up once we get towards, like, the turn of the century. And that, I think that all grows out of this racial intolerance and racial conflict at the end of the Civil War.
Yeah. So the next cycle we have is the Great Power Cycle. This is the 20th century America. And the first generation, idealist type, is the missionary generation.
So this is going to be the generation then that is taking over where the early progressives left off. So they're going to be the ones that are, how would I say this? The progressive movement is such a long-lasting movement, the progressive Gilded Age. So they're the ones that pre-World War I, but post-turn of the century are really starting to come of age in that, like, 19-teens era, right? So you'll see with that, you'll see a lot of discussion on, I think, that this is really where you're starting to see this, like, immigration is a big topic. You're seeing the state power, like, the state interjection into, like, every part of society. So, like, people are starting to talk about law very differently. They're starting to talk about, like, industrialized centers, like large major urban centers very differently. And they're setting the stage then for, we're going to go back into our reactives after this, they're setting the stage for the next generation to have to deal with this world that's about to succumb to, like, a colonial war, largely, right?
I feel like the missionary generation doesn't get talked about much, but this is a really strong generation of women leaders.
Okay, yeah.
And kind of putting their stamp on America.
Yeah, this would have been the Jane Addams would have been born in this generation, right? I could be wrong.
I think, isn't that where a lot of this generation is? It's a combination of the progressive and the missionary who kind of have women's voting rights and
so women's suffrage is definitely being talked about at this point. You're definitely seeing this. So I agree with where you're coming from. I see that point, and I think that what you do see a lot is that through both women fighting for their own suffrage, you'll also see women participating in this more maternal outlook on society, and you're starting to see that they would call themselves like progressive leaders, but women like Jane Addams will eventually bring up like this idea of like a whole house, which is a community house where immigrant families, poor families can come and they can get an education, they can work, there's structures set in place for these still, but it's women really largely like creating their own access when they don't necessarily have the right to vote, and once they get the right to vote, how they're using that right and how they're using that vote seems to be a major point in this idea.
So then the next generation, the reactive type, is the lost generation.
Yeah. So this is a generation that I wanted to talk about with you. One of my advisors when I was in Charleston wrote a great book called Wastelands, Scott Poole. It looks at World War I and the destruction that World War I brought, both on physical land of these countries involved, but then also like on the body. So he claims that this is the rise of like modern horror is going to grow out of this. And I was just thinking about it when I was reading the Reactive Generation here. These are the men that are being sent into a massive global conflict and are seeing destruction on a level that we've never seen before.
Never, because now you have war and killing industrialized.
Exactly.
And before this, it's not like that at all.
Exactly. And what that does to the human body when you're seeing people shot by machine guns and digging trench warfare where they're in long, brutal stalemates of just not even making any ground.
And the only thing you can do is just pass the time thinking about when you're going to die.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And from the American perspective here, we entered that war later, but when you think about it from the European point of view, I mean, this is just wholly destructive to society,
completely.
Right? Like, cities are being wiped out, whole generations of people are being wiped out. And it's staggering to really look at the amount of physical damage, but then psychological damage that's imposed on this generation. I think the psychological damage continues on, and you can see it in a lot of the artists and the writing. It's basically like, you have the generation before that's comes about during this like spiritual time, mm-hmm. and they're very spiritual, religious, and mm-hmm. this generation's like, what's the point of life? Mm-hmm. And so what they do is they'll indulge themselves, sex and booze and drugs or whatever, because you don't know. What's the point of life? I'm just going to enjoy it as long as I can, right? Right. So why I mentioned that Wastelands book is that what it largely shows is like this generation that went off and fought this war and then comes home, they're manifesting their trauma into artistic expression that lays the groundwork for like the modernity of horror as a genre that we consume. So
interesting.
Yeah. So it's the idea of body horror and like losing limbs, like that really comes out of this World War I generation because that's what they saw every day. So he cites like Dracula as a really big example. This idea of a zombie or like a ghoul really grows out of the post-World War I generation, and putting their psychological traumas and then they're also like their physical traumas that they themselves have into an artistic expression, which ends up becoming horror. It's just a very interesting book. Yeah.
That would have been, man, I mean, any time in history would be a tough time, I feel like. But man, if you're like coming to age or, you're in your adulthood as part of this generation, it's pretty gloomy.
Yeah.
It's dark, very dark.
Yeah, definitely. And the questions that I think might be kind of overlooked here is the whole book in general is very Western. It's an American history book, but what this war and what this generational struggle does to the world, both like physically, but then on like a colonial mindset, you're starting to see so much of the world fight this battle over territory that's not in Central Europe, right? They're fighting huge conflicts over like African colonies and colonies in the Middle East and Asia, and it'll continue to stay there into World War II. But just how massive and destructive the First World War was is just kind of almost like incomprehensible to really understand. So it's overshadowed by World War II, because World War II, there's a clear good guy, bad guy. Right.
World War I, it's this. I listened to when I was back on the farm when I'm on the tractor, listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and he does 6 episodes or 8, whatever it is, and they're like 3 hours each, and he goes into detail, and there's all these alliances that are being made. So when the Archduke is assassinated, this country is looking over there and be like, hey, well, you're in alignment with us, so you have to like help us out if there's a problem. And then the other country is like going to their allies and be like, hey, well, we're together too. So then you have this web just like tangled up of, and it just, the industrial scale of the killing, it's for like what? It's like
for inches. There's like so many of these World War I battles are fought for, feet, hundreds of feet to make advancements, and it's shocking.
It's crazy.
Yeah. We'll get into it again when we get into World War II, which I guess we could just jump into right now. But
we got the GI generation.
Yeah.
Civic type.
Right. So these are going to be for lack of a better term, the heroes of World War II, right? They're going to be the ones that are born in that 1920s era, and they're coming of age and serving in the Second World War. They're, the crusaders against fascism, and so in the most simple term here. One of the distinctions, I was just curious as to what you thought about it, was you had mentioned with World War I being so destructive because it's a global conflict with this like industrialized way of killing. And when you look back at that war, I think so many people critique all of the countries involved for using like chemical warfare, and it's kind of seen as like a large-scale negative, which I agree with. But then in the next war, you have people using atomic energy as a weapon, and it's referred to as a means to an end, as a means to end the war quicker. And I think that people in World War I would have made the same argument, that they maybe detested the idea of chemical warfare, but it was an opportunity to end the war quicker. So it's just weird how one of those generations is kind of tarnished for their use of like technology and killing, and then the other one is kind of heralded as like the saviors of humanity for it.
It's a super interesting point.
Super weird.
Wow. I feel like World War II, so much is going on. So many people are involved in the war effort, women working in the factories, and just like it's a collective thing. And you have GI scientists that are creating the nuclear bomb, and no one really knows, and they're testing it, and it's just like the world was just focused on that war, and they just wanted it over with. I don't know.
And wanted it over with, and as you had mentioned earlier, it's during the time the stories that are coming out from the Axis powers are pretty clear that these are the bad guys in the war, right? People are pretty much detesting the actions of the Axis powers on a scale that, well, it exists in World War I think it's just magnified tenfold with World War II.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the interesting points that I wanted to bring up about the World War II generation, you had mentioned it, was like the collectiveness of it. And I think it's interesting because it's like a forced collectiveness through this idea that the structural change that's being implemented here is quite literally because society cannot work. If your working male population is fighting a war overseas, you still need to have industry, you still need to have production, you still need to have a society at home. It's just women, like you mentioned, like they start to work, and those are the structural changes that are almost forced upon our society because of the war. So it's just an interesting time period there where.
But it's interesting too how like you see how that does work, and it kind of changes the way the economy is structured moving forward.
Oh right, yeah,
you know,
definitely
fascinating. Okay, so then we have the last one of that cycle is the silent generation.
Yeah, the silent generations that have always been a very intriguing generation to me, because they're really the ones that are, they're growing up in this 50s white picket fence society where their parents are being heralded as like the heroes and like the saviors of democracy, and in that regard they're maybe a little overlooked because they aren't matching up to their parents, but they are living into it. They're coming into their own in a society that's very conducive to like their own personal growth. There's not large-scale economic problems. There's not as large-scale global political conflict coming out of this in the same level of like a World War II or a World War I, right? There's definitely still conflicts, especially like between the rise of communism and democracy, but it's a generation of kids that are not necessarily having to interact with that conflict, right?
They're very young when the Depression is going on and
right.
World War II. I think of my grandma when she was very young, and she talks about the rations and
right.
the rubber and black market Johnny with
right.
the meat. And
right.
like, you know.
Right. And so when they're in their 20s, they're the ones that are.
They miss the World War II.
Right. They missed World War II, but now they get to reap the benefits of the society that grew out of World War II.
But at the same time, too, like, so they missed that window to be the hero, but they also then have to deal with the rest of their lives hearing about the GI generation and like
Greatest Generation, yeah.
And like, oh, were you there fighting in the war?
Right,
You know, like
right,
there's always
right.
that the GIs can just hold over their heads, you know?
Which I mean, I think happens throughout. They're almost gone now. The Greatest Generation is almost totally gone and will be in the next 20 years. But I think even today we still see that. I mean, we literally call them the Greatest Generation. Like, that's the other term for them.
Yeah.
And I think my experiences with people I've done a lot of research with World War II veterans when I was an undergrad, and they know, they feel it, they definitely identify it, and they're not afraid to tell you that they know that that's what they are, and that they're very confident in their place as the Greatest Generation. Yeah.
The blemish of the GI generation is the Vietnam War and the leadership there, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a complicated topic because I think there's so much to be discussed about like global politics in the Cold War that is like fundamental to understanding that.
Yeah.
And then also once you get into that baby boom generation, the like total rejection of the draft and of fighting a ideological war against someone across the globe that hasn't necessarily done anything to you or your own. So like, why are we there and why are we dying? And then that mixed with this new type of warfare that's coming out of World War II, right? So like war is forever changed out of this. We're trying to avoid these large-scale world conflicts again. So you start to see these like smaller guerrilla tactics kind of take over in warfare, and particularly within Vietnam, it's just something that a lot of this leadership had never experienced. So they didn't know how to interact with a lot of this more abstract conflict way of fighting and conflict, and that's over in the war. And then internally at home, you have people who are like fundamentally rejecting the idea of this war, and they're fed up with the idea of being the ones that have to take that stance, and they want to just go out and have fun, and like that's going to be the baby boomers.
So now the cycle we're in, the Millennial Cycle.
Yeah, here we
go. The boomers start off the idealist type.
Yep. We had mentioned it earlier. This is the summer of love, hippie piece, going out to Woodstock and just enjoying life. It's rebelling against their parents who were the more strict 1950s family, and they're believing that they're going to have fun while they're kids. They're not going to go fight in these foreign wars. They're going to reject the idea of the draft in Vietnam, but they're also going to believe that they're right for the rest of the time that they're around. And
yeah, Yeah, that's true.
And largely a lot of that comes from the fact that there's just so many of them, right? There's just so many, and they all come out of this period of growth where, the 1950s are economically a good time for the country, and a lot of these families are having multiple children, and just through the power of sheer numbers, they're able to impact so many different aspects of society. So as a generation, there's the thought and the ideology that is this summer of love and this peace rhetoric is really just permeating throughout their younger lives, and then they're going to move on and control politics once they get into that age where they're starting to care more in the late 70s and 80s.
I thought it was interesting, too, in what would be like the 80s, they have Reagan,
right,
and they have more of like a religious awakening.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to bring that up when we started to talk about Reagan.
Yeah.
This is such a fascinating generation to me because the contradiction of the generation is staggering. Where you and I have talked off record before a lot about my personal hero being Fred Hampton. He would have been a boomer, a baby boomer.
Yeah.
And he's very radical. But then to look at those people who are, growing up and are going to be the fighters of the civil rights movement, electing Ronald Reagan in the 80s is so contradictory to what I assumed that generation would have done. So it's just very fascinating and interesting to me that that's where they ended up. So, yeah, I don't know. It's crazy.
So then Gen X is after them.
How I've always thought about Gen X, I have a special spot in my heart for Gen X. I think they are, again, this is probably breaking away a little bit from the book, but just from my own personal, they always seem to be the ones that just create the art and music and film and everything that I love. I grew up on all those cartoons that I grew up when I was a kid. Those are all made by Gen Xers, right? So it's just such a creative, interesting, weird type of art form that's coming out of this generation that I just really love, have a special spot in my heart for. Again, they're going to be this silent, more forgotten generation, but I personally just love their cultural impact in the country.
See, I don't really pay attention much to Gen X culture. I'm more boomer culture.
Interesting.
I'm not really into video games or sci-fi or really watching movies or 90s alternative rock. I don't like. I see the Gen X as really independent, kind of hands off, and their parents would take them to rated R movies, or no, they weren't even rated. They were just
whatever.
So, but I think some of the people that I pay attention to, I think, are from that era, and they're entrepreneurs, and they're kind of the first ones to. They might not get the recognition that maybe the millennials in sheer numbers have done with remote working and that type of thing.
Definitely.
I think they kind of started that and kind of paved the way for us to kind of enjoy that.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like you had said it. They are sandwiched in between two very, very combative generations, with the boomers on one end and then millennials on the other. But so in so many ways, I kind of feel like they're the forgotten ones that even today we still just don't even maybe consider their impact. But I think you're right. I think that technologically what they provided and creatively what they came up with is very impressive. And it's like you said, very independent, not necessarily for the glam and glory of it all, but because it's just a creative, interesting thing that they really are passionate about. They're going to do it. Why not?
Okay, millennials.
All right. This is, again, we probably need to note when it was published, because the millennials are realistically born in that early 80s. They say 82-ish. But the book is published in 91. So I was born in 94. I'm a millennial, but I wasn't even a twinkle in the eye at this point, right? So the theory at parts still holds up, I would say. I'm interested to hear what you think about it. But some of their examples here seem like they just were kind of throwing darts at what might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The Millennial Generation. I've always thought of it as, and they do mention this, cohorts,
Yeah.
right? So you have, around your peers, there's usually like a 3 to 4 year on both sides, and
Right.
it's kind of like you experience whatever you're experiencing together. So I always pictured it as like 1980, 82, whatever it is, to like 86, 87, and then like the Millennial Generation has 3 cohorts, or like SubGenerations. And then I would consider myself part of the middle cohort, SubGeneration, which would be like 86-ish to like 94.
Yeah.
And then like 95 to like 2000.
Right.
Because, well, this is what's so interesting about this book is that all of a sudden the internet happens a few years after this book, right?
Yeah.
Or like how we know it
Yeah.
to be in a way, or
evolved into
it's
the more accessible version of what
So
it is,
this book, when you're reading through it, it's pretty linear.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of on the same plane.
It definitely reads like
experiences
a what you would assume a history book of America, just with this interesting twist on it. But then I think I know where you're going with
and
this.
then the internet just like it
Shock
puts a
and awe.
wrench into
Yeah.
everything, and
Yeah.
it accelerates
Definitely.
everything. Where in the 20-year span of a generation, typically,
Right.
there wouldn't be a whole lot of difference between them, the individuals in it.
Right.
And now it's like the technology and the internet and
Even
and
a
culture.
few years could be
Yeah.
crazy.
It's so it's interesting as a whole of a generation. There's so much variance,
Yeah.
and at the same time too, I still feel like there's a common bond.
I totally agree. I definitely see that like collective identity between millennials. But it's crazy to like look at the experiences of them. And you're right, it's that technological shift with the internet and with the ability to communicate via phones later in the generation, like that. It's being able to have access to information at your fingertips.
We're also straddling, at least the older millennials, straddling a world where it's still very physical. You would go to the library,
Yeah.
encyclopedias for research,
Definitely.
and at the same time too, we're starting to use Wikipedia, and they're showing us how to research online.
Yeah.
And then the younger subgeneration just has the one experience.
Yeah.
So we're kind of straddling the line there,
Yeah, I've
and
definitely.
it makes us
Go ahead.
unique, which is a millennial characteristic we always love to talk
Throw
about
around.
ourselves.
Yeah. I've thought about this a ton because it's just so interesting to me. I remember growing up, and my childhood was very much riding my bike around the neighborhood, going to play in the like baseball in the sand lot in the neighborhood, kind of things like that. Very physical. We didn't have the internet on the same way that we do later. But then I also remember those days of like when me and my friends, when the internet blew up and we were all nerdy kids wanting to go play video games, we would like tape our phones to our heads so that we could talk to each other while we were playing our games on the computer. And it's that straddling the line of like, I remember a time when technology hadn't caught up yet, and it was in those very, very early stages of technological advancements through the internet and through communication that I don't think anyone born really too much after me is ever going to experience that. Their world, they're going to always kind of know technology as being an all-encompassing part of their society, right? Like they're not going to have that period where cell phones aren't a thing, right? When I remember a time very vividly where like cell phones weren't a common thing at all.
I do remember those days.
So it's just fascinating to me. It's weird.
These are the type of things that when we're 80 years old, we're going to be telling people
Yeah.
about, like the world
Yeah.
before, and we grew up during this time,
Yeah.
and look how special we are.
Yeah, definitely.
But do you think we're one of the first generations too, where our parents are looking at us being like, how can you do 4 things at once right now?
I think they say it in the later, like the very, very end, maybe like chapter 13 or something, but they talk about how there's like advertisements saying, my 8-year-old taught me science, and it would be like in any other generation that would be like laughed at. But now it's like, no, I think my 8-year-old actually might know more science than me. They just have more access to this stuff, and they're able to go on their computer and read about some random thing and read a book and go do a million things at once. And it's just, I think that's a really thrilling part of being a millennial, is we have access to this. So I see it a lot. It seems like millennials are just constantly thriving for that pursuit of like some form of education or expression that is only available because of the internet, and really only available because of the access to this information. So.
Every generation before, you look to your elders to solve problems.
Right.
And now, with the technological advances, the older generations are looking to us to solve their technology problems, right? Which is this total opposite thing.
So, I mean, I like on that point where, you know, even the most basic things, like when you're a kid and you're learning to drive and you get a flat tire, your parent teaches you how to change your tire, right? That's something that I think millennials today and the generation following us will look up on our own, just how to do these like more basic tasks that the previous generation would normally instill in you. But then also the generations before us, and they're going to look to us to explain how a cell phone works. Like how do I turn my computer on? What remote do I use to get the subtitles on the TV? And it's just something that we're more familiar with just because of our place in that technological revolution.
You have this intersection of the technology revolution, internet, but also just the history of where we're placed, where a lot of resources was invested in us learning, putting a lot of care into our development, and so we are one of the most educated generations.
Right.
And with that, just education-wise, we're able to teach ourselves more and more. It's like a self-sustaining model in a way.
When I was growing up, it was the only thing I was told when I was in school was, you need to go to college, college is how you'll get a career, it's going to be a good job. Every single person I know, to some extent, pursued education past high school, where I feel like previous generations, it was maybe more encouraged to get into a trade or do your own like entrepreneurial path. And for us, it definitely feels like education and advancing yourself through that is kind of the primary force for so many people that I know that I grew up with. Like that's.
I agree, but I also think I think that was kind of the model that was like handed down, and like the boomer generation saw that, oh, if you want like a secure, stable life, like get good grades, go to school, get a good job, work hard, save, hit all these milestones.
Right.
And I think what we have seen, I think we're experiencing it now, where there's kind of like this saturation, this bubble where everybody now has college degrees.
Right.
And now those trades are becoming a lot more
I agree.
valuable to have skills in. So it's like kind of this this reaction to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It fits nicely into the conversation of like a cycle for the book, which is interesting.
Yeah. So where do you think the Millennial Generation goes from here?
That's an interesting question. It's difficult because it's predictive, and as a historian, you never really want to fall too much into this. But for sake of discussion, I'll try my best. I think that where we're going from here, and what we'll see in the near future, is this unity through a more radical, more progressive political ideology and cultural ideology, in the sense of the rights that we're demanding, and the kind of this rejection of the Reagan state that we've lived in for so long now. This 80s very conservative turn and this neoliberal turn with Clinton. I think we're going to see a rejection of that, and then I think we're going to see millennials set up a society in which I see it as setting up a more empathetic, a more understanding, and a more inclusive society for everyone. Is kind of our path right now. I think it's complicated to say like specific events, but we've talked about college debt reform, prison reform, environmental reform, and I think that those are some of these tasks that we're going to kind of take under our wing, revolutionize, and then hopefully set up for next generations to kind of build on.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. What about you?
I agree with a lot of those concepts. I think it's a matter of how we go about doing it.
Mm-hmm.
One part of that is like banging on the door, like this is what we want, and I'm more so of the like, how do we involve more people in this conversation and listen to them and try to like explain and meet with them to kind of share our own thoughts with them, reason and logical way, so that we can transition, so it's not revolution, it's more so of a smoother transition into the future.
Interesting.
That's what I would hope. But I really love how our generation is very collaborative and more inclusive, and how our generation is more focused on empathy and listening to others and moving forward with those in mind, those qualities.
Yeah, and I should clarify, because I feel like maybe this didn't come off the right way. Between like a surface level left and right politically, I think that like communication and inclusion between those groups and conversation is important, and I think that people on both sides of the aisle, political aisle, would agree with a lot of the reform that millennials are going to be proposing. I guess what I was saying, that the revolution is going to come in the form of a rejection from the top 1% and the income inequality and wealth distribution of our country and then the world at large. I think that's going to be where the revolution really takes place, and millennials are going to be the ones calling for this radical change there for the betterment of society, because we see the damages that has done to us. Not necessarily that it's so black and white, left and right politically.
It's more so identifying these are the challenges that are going to come. Mm-hmm. How do we solve these problems together? Right. Where it's not left or right issue. It's more so like, well, the stuff is happening. We need to take care of it.
The environment. Right.
Yeah. So to close out this discussion on the book.
Yeah.
What do you think about the book as a whole? Do you think it was helpful?
So I would say that to a popular audience who's interested in American history, that it's a great, interesting perspective. It's kind of impossible to deny some of these cycles and some of these. They always say when you see repetition, you should acknowledge it and figure out why. And I think that they do it. There's a lot of research here. Their theory is something I had not considered prior to reading it, so it's very interesting to me. I do feel like there are. Historically, sometimes they pigeonhole some of their actors and some of their events to fit a specific generation when that might not be the most appropriate way to do so. So there's that aspect. And then I also feel like I'm very fascinated and would be very interested in talking to them about this theory on a global scale, because this is obviously an American history book. Mm-hmm. But does the same generational structure fit in with non-U.S. countries? Does it fit in? Could you use the same generational framework to consider Russia from, their revolution in the early 1900s to becoming a Soviet state and then coming back away from that Soviet state? I'd be very interested to see if there's the same structure could be used, and I feel like it's a very Western book. There's not a lot of discussion on non-predominantly white nations. We don't get a discussion of an Africa or and I just would be interested to see if that generational framework is still consistent globally.
I don't know if it would be. It's really fun.
Yeah.
If you're interested in American history, it's fun.
Yeah, and I will say, visually, it looks like a big book, like a thick book, but you really do fly through it. It's pretty easy read. It's not too complicated at any point. Once you get past the idea of what they're explaining through their theory, the rest of it reads very fluid.
I would agree.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So it's definitely, it looks maybe a little bit more intimidating than it actually is. And I think it's a great jumping off point for a lot of really great conversation for people who think alike and for people who think very differently. I think that it's a tool for discussion, and I appreciate that.
I appreciate you coming on. This is fun. We'll do it again.
Yeah, definitely.
Different book.
I would love to.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rich.